Hey there, HorseCenter fans. Matt and I are back with another exciting edition of the show. Matt, I've been waiting for 10 years to do this particular edition.
I bet you have, Brian. It's not only New Year's coming up, it's the end of the decade. So Brian and I are going to give you folks the best of this past decade. There was a lot of good stuff, my friend.
Great racing. Some of the great horses we're also going to talk about as Matt and I run down the decade. Watch it all right now on HorseCenter. Welcome to another edition of HorseCenter, everyone. I am Brian Zipsy, and as always, I have the super duper pleasure of being joined by my co-host on the East Coast. That's Matt Shipman. How are you today, Matt?
I am very good, Brian. I'd like to wish you a happy new year and a happy new decade.
Oh, a happy new year and a happy new decade as we seamlessly segue into our show. We're talking about the decade, the 2010s, Matt. Can you believe we're around to be talking about the 2010s already? Wow. We are getting a little bit older, my friend, but now I digress. What we're going to do, folks, is we are going to run down many of our favorite races of the past 10 years. There's a lot of good ones. We left some good ones off, but hey, it's only about a half an hour show. So let's roll with it. Matt, are you ready?
I am ready. Let's do it.
Let's do it. And let's go back, starting with this year. I think it was the race of the year, Matt. It was at Saratoga. I believe you were there in person. It was the Personal Ensign. Remember how good Personal Ensign was. Grade 1 fillies and mares at Saratoga. And we had a throwdown in the stretch of that particular race, sir.
We sure did. And hey, two of the characteristics of great races have to be very, very good horses battling it out head to head down the stretch. And last year's, this past summer's edition of the Personal Ensign had just that, with Midnight Bisou renewing short-lived rival with Elate at Saratoga.
Yeah, it was their third meeting of the year. It was the same winner each time. It's Midnight Bisou got it done, Matt. Midnight Bisou had a terrific year. Sans her second place finish in the Breeders' Cup Distaff. She went through the entire calendar year, which started in January for her, undefeated. This was the most exciting race yet. For me, a great race often involves either head-to-head battles or it involves a horse getting up just in the last jump. This basically had both because Elate was not succumbing to Midnight Bisou flying at her there on the outside. And Midnight Bisou was just so good that she got there. Neither one won in the Breeders' Cup. Midnight Bisou second in the Breeders' Cup Distaff, as I said. Elate chose to run against the boys at 1.25 miles. She was fourth, which wasn't a bad finish for her. Two really top mares. Now, it's been a great decade for the filly and mares, so maybe Midnight Bisou and Elate aren't the top filly and mares we've had over the last 10 years, but they are two really, really good ones, and this is as good as it gets for those two.
That is for sure, and maybe they aren't even the top fillies or mares going at it head-to-head down the stretch in one of our best races of the decade.
Yeah, or maybe not even second best, but don't give away too much too early, sir. Come on, we have a long way to go here. Next, we're going to go back 1 year. We're going to hop back to the summer of 2018, or I guess it would be the very late spring of 2018, Matt, because if a horse wins a Triple Crown, and for people younger than us, they've only seen it twice, you need to recognize that as one of the momentous happenings in horse racing. We were there in person, both of us together, Matt. I'm pretty sure I remember that. Of course, I'm talking about the Belmont Stakes 2018 and Justify.
Yes, Brian. And if we were to summarize this decade, just what you mentioned alone, 2 Triple Crown winners after that multi-decade absence makes this 2010 decade a very, very special one. And yes, we were there at Belmont Park. Justify going for another Triple Crown for Bob Baffert, for Mike Smith in riding in there, and Justify broke smartly right out of the gate, went to the lead all the way around. at that start. It was Gronkowski, our friend from that we mentioned last week, all the way in the back, way, way, way in the back. And you mentioned it, Brian, a characteristic of a great race, a horse coming from behind.
All right. Well, I don't even remember who was behind Justify, Matt. No, actually, I do remember because one of my favorites, Vino Rosso, was behind Justify. And maybe Vino Rosso helps to justify the question, well, who did Justify ever beat? Because Vino Rosso was behind him a couple times, and he, of course, won the Breeders' Cup Classic recently this year. Justify 6 races, Matt, 6 lifetime races. We would never see him race again after this Belmont Stakes, but he's the only horse ever to retire still undefeated as a Triple Crown winner. That's something. And Justify, he did it in a variety of ways. The Belmont Stakes was all about Justify, and it was one of, two Triple Crowns of the last 40 years. Has to be on our list. Let's go back one more year, Matt. And, Gunrunner was a nice, I saw him, by the way, break his maiden in his debut performance, Gunrunner at Churchill Downs. He was a nice 2-year-old. He was a very good 3-year-old, consistent 3-year-old, ran in all the big races and was right there often, besides being a multiple graded stakes winner. The beginning of his 4-year-old year, he wasn't the top dirt horse in the country, but by the second half of his 4-year-old year, he was a monster that wasn't getting beat. We chose the Whitney, Matt. Why did we choose the Whitney to show off the prowess of Gunrunner?
And you make a great point. There turned out to be so many excellent performances by Gunrunner, and as the year went along, that year of 2017, there were more and more. But that Whitney at Saratoga was the famous horseshoe in the tail race. And you can see Gunrunner's weighted down tail flopping around at the finish of that race at Saratoga, and that's what made that race such a media star for Gunrunner.
Yeah, it's hard to see in this video, but if you look closely or you stop it at the right time, you can see that horseshoe from another horse getting entangled in Gunrunner's tail early. It was in the backstretch, pretty early in the backstretch of this Grade 1 Whitney, and certainly didn't slow down Gunrunner one iota. Gunrunner much the best in the Whitney, as he was throughout all of his last several races. And a little known fact for horse, this is for HorseCenter fans only, the next time Matt Shipman went to Saratoga, he wore an artificial tail with a horseshoe entangled in it, just in honor of Gunrunner's Whitney. Wow, that's maybe too much information. But anyway, Matt, the 4th race on our list is also from 2017. I alluded to Arrogate just a little bit when I said Gunrunner was not the best older horse in the country or the best dirt horse in the country or the world early on that year, because certainly the best dirt horse at that point was Arrogate, Matt. Arrogate just rolled through the Travers, the Breeders' Cup Classic, the Pegasus World Cup. But I think his most impressive race of all came overseas in the Dubai World Cup. Arrogate wins the 2017 big race that made time.
Yes, that is for sure, because in that race, Arrogate uncharacteristically broke very badly. Last place, kind of dawdling out of the gate. And it also pointed out that Gunrunner ran a fabulous race in there, right up on the pace early on, took control of the race, looked like a winner. But as you said, Brian, at that point of the year, I think it was in March, Arrogate was still the best dirt horse because he made a big run down the stretch under Mike Smith and was able to overtake Gunrunner down the stretch. And I guess that all that we've said just points out what a big move that was, because it was Gunrunner who would go on and be the best dirt horse in the second half of the year in there. So Arrogate over Gunrunner in Dubai.
Gunrunner was top notch, Matt, but there are still people that'll say Arrogate was the best horse that ran on American soil in the last decade. And if you just watch 4 races or so, it's hard to disagree. That's how good Arrogate was. And I'm going to go a little further than you. I think this may have been the greatest performance of any horse in the decade. Arrogate got out of the gate a little slow, but he was really checked and bothered and squeezed and pushed back. So it wasn't all his dawdling out of the gate. He was left for behind, left probably a loser of this huge race with a really top-notch horse running his race in Gun Runner. And it didn't matter to Arrogate. He just inhaled everything after that. Awesome, awesome performance in that Dubai World Cup. Speaking of awesome performances, Matt, the year before, right, the Breeders' Cup, I think the filly and mares stole the thunder a little bit from that Arrogate California Chrome matchup, because the Breeders' Cup Distaff for 2016 has to be one of the best races of the decade. It had to be, for me, the best race of the year. Of course, I'm talking about what Beholder and Songbird did down the Santa Anita stretch in the Breeders' Cup Distaff.
That is absolutely for sure, Brian. You're talking about, hey, two of the best fillies, not just that year, not just in that decade, but two absolutely fabulous fillies that have to be right up near the top on anybody's list. Beholder with so many great victories, so many Breeders' Cup victories, Eclipse Awards, Songbird, just winning and winning and winning and winning. And let me tell you what, those two threw it down, Brian. They threw it down on the stretch every step of the way with a photo finish that people still talk about. People still want to see the photo finish picture up there and say, hey, wait a second. I think Songbird won. Even looking at that photo, it was, Brian, just an absolutely amazing race.
Yeah, two amazing horses. Beholder, of course, had been around for years, and maybe she was past her prime, but it sure didn't look like it in this Breeders' Cup Distaff. Songbird, of course, was just an awesome daughter of Medaglia d'Oro, as Matt said, who won just about everything. And yeah, it doesn't get any better of a battle than we saw in that 2016 Breeders' Cup Distaff. I want to do one more race from this year. People will hem and haw at me a little bit about this one, because Frosted was far from a perfect horse. He never could really get by American Pharoah, although he often gave American Pharoah some trouble. Well, especially in that Travers, he was the horse that chased him early in the stretch in the Belmont. But Frosted was a really talented horse, a really good horse. I think he's underrated, but he just didn't always put things together in some of his races. But he did one afternoon for sure. He did several afternoons, but one afternoon in particular, we were there in person together. Again, Matt, we were down on the rail, if you remember. And frankly, if Arrogate's performance in the Dubai World Cup was not the performance of the decade, I think this one very well may have been, because the way Frosted won that Met Mile, the time that came back, the speed figures that came back, and the way he just left a bunch of good milers, including a Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile winner, a future Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile winner, in his rearview mirror, and far in his rearview mirror, was really, I was awestruck by that performance, Matt.
Yeah, Brian, and Frosted was one of those horses that when he was good, he was very, very, very good. But like you said, it didn't mean that he always came up with those performances. But that 2016 Met Mile was one of those races where all the pieces came together and puts that race into our favorite races of the decade.
Absolutely. He was one of my favorite horses of the decade, of course, as everyone here at HorseCenter knows. He did win the Grade 1 Whitney after the Met Mile, but that Met Mile was just above and beyond anything that he did outside of a very nice career, just not as good as American Pharoah or California Chrome. I want to do one more race. 2016 seems to be a theme here, Matt, and you might wonder why we chose this one out of all California's Chrome wins, but I'm talking about early in the year. It was the San Pasqual. It wasn't the strongest of fields by any means, but it was California Chrome returning, and we hadn't really seen a Triple Crown type of horse do something like this. California Chrome went over to Dubai. He went over to England. He lost all sorts of weight. Everything went wrong for California Chrome in 2015. And we remember what a popular Triple Crown, a near Triple Crown winner he had been the year before. So when he came back in the San Pasquale and returned triumphantly, I just think it was a great story.
Yeah, Brian, because as you mentioned, with all of the races that California Chrome won, his Kentucky Derby, his Preakness as a 3-year-old, and then he transitioned and won on the turf. Those were all great victories, but I think this was part of a story of California Chrome. Part of what made the Chromies so, such rabid fans was that after all of that, maybe some mismanagement by the ownership, the horse coming out of the barn of fan favorite Art Sherman there for a while. So many things. When he came back to California, back to Art Sherman in that race and won again. That was a great story. It was just another feather in the cap of California Chrome for a long career. He beat Imperative in there, who was a good solid horse in California, but it was about the return.
Yeah, and I think Opportunity was third, another very nice horse. But anyway, yeah, it was about the return, and it was about Chapter 2, and it may not have resonated with me so much if Chapter 2 wasn't so very good for California Chrome. But of course, he returned in high style the rest of 2016. So it was just a really great story on one of our most popular horses of the decade, most successful horses of the decade, California Chrome. Chapter 2 started there at the San Pasquale, and it moved on successfully. Now we're going to jump back a little bit. Over 2 years before that was one of the best Breeders' Cup Classics, if not of the decade, of the history of the Breeders' Cup Classic. Maybe we didn't have any true superstars in the 2013 edition of the Breeders' Cup Classic, but we had a lot of good horses like Mucho Macho Man, Will Take Charge, Declaration of War. Of course, I'm talking about the three principals at the finish. Fort Larned, the previous year's winner, Game On Dude. There were a lot of good horses in that classic. And Mucho Macho Man and Will Take Charge especially really gave us an exciting finish in the 2013 Breeders' Cup Classic.
Yeah, it was one of those Breeders' Cup Classics. Big field, lots of quality horses in there, including Mucho Macho Man. A whole bunch of them battling it out on the front end, with Mucho Macho Man taking control as they headed into the stretch. But Will Take Charge, who had so much momentum, not just, I use that literally, for his closing move down the stretch in this race, but also because of the way his career developed that season. Will Take Charge had that closing move that you mentioned, Brian, that often makes for a great race. And it was a photo finish between Mucho Macho Man and Will Take Charge.
Yeah, really cool finish, Matt. An older horse. Mucho Macho Man had been around for a few years, kind of a bit of a Cinderella story, trained by Kathy Ritvo. A successful horse, but had never really broken through in the biggest one. Remember, he was in the money in the Kentucky Derby earlier in the decade. So a really nice, big giant of a horse, popular horse, finally got it done, and Will Take Charge. That was one of his final races that clinched a 3-year-old Eclipse Award for the D. Wayne Lucas, one of D. Wayne Lucas's last on a long list of many top horses. That Breeders' Cup Classic win was race was a good one, Matt. But the year before, if you ask me, what was the best Triple Crown race of the decade, I'm going to point to Baltimore 2012. It was the Preakness, obviously, but it was a rematch between Bodemeister and I'll Have Another. And I just thought one of the best races that we've seen, one of the best Triple Crown races we've seen in recent years. And I'm still a little astonished that I'll Have Another was able to run down Bodemeister that last 100 yards.
Yeah, and that quality is also what makes great races when it's a little bit of a rivalry, when it's a rematch. And in the Kentucky Derby, Bodie Meister had been on the lead, and I'll Have Another was able to run him down. And then they threw it down again in the Preakness with Bodie Meister on the lead, setting the fractions, repelling challengers. Sure looked like a winner this time, Brian, but I'll Have Another kicked it in and was able to get the second jewel of the Triple Crown under his belt. Of course, he didn't get to run in the Belmont Stakes, getting scratched just the day before the race.
Yeah, it's a shame we didn't see more from either one of these horses, I'll Have Another and Bodie Meister, because I think this Preakness was the proving point where we really realized how good these two were. I'll Have Another had a little bit of trouble early in the stretch there. And I remember the gray horse in the middle, Creative Cause, was a very nice horse, now a nice stallion. And these two just left Creative Cause way back in third. Bodie Meister was a monster talent. Remember how good he was in the Arkansas Derby. And for I'll Have Another to show that kind of resolute determination to just nail him on the wire was some race. My favorite Triple Crown race of the decade. All right, Matt, we're going to go back one more year. 2011 was the year, and there's a couple of races I want to talk about here, but my favorite race of 2011 has to be, it's not Midnight Bassoon and a late, it's not Beholder and Songbird, but it's every bit as good as them. This was the third one where we saw two just outstanding fillies and mares going ding-donging it. And, Matt, and most importantly for me, this was a true rivalry. These two, Blind Luck and Havre de Grace, ran many, many times together.
Yes, so this, yeah, absolutely, Brian. This race included a lot of those elements that we talked about. It was the rivalry of Blind Luck and Havre de Grace, and it was the horse that was tended to be out front in Havre de Grace, and Blind Luck making the big late move. It was also, Brian, the rivalry of two very, very good riders who are not on the track anymore. The late Garrett Gomez, rider of Blind Luck, and Ramon Dominguez, who was at the peak of a fantastic career riding Havre de Grace in the Delaware handicap. Of course, injuries prompted Ramon's retirement, and Havre de Grace took care of the horses out front, had the lead, and then came Blind Luck.
Yeah, just a marvelous edition of the Delaware Handicap, the best edition of the Delaware Handicap I've ever seen. Two great mares renewing their rivalry at a track that they had done it before in the Delaware Oaks, and great point on Garrett Gomez and Ramon Dominguez, two riders for different reasons that are missed very much at the racetrack. All right, Matt, let's go back one more year, and I'm going to go ahead and say it right now, Matt. For me, no race in the decade was bigger, and I mean that in a lot of different ways, than the 2010 Breeders' Cup Classic. I was there at Churchill Downs, and it was maybe one of 5 races of my lifetime where the feeling, the emotion, the sheer energy of the racetrack was palpable. And of course, I'm talking about Zenyatta's final race against a really, really good older male in Blame. And Blame and Zenyatta coming down the stretch in the Breeders' Cup Classic, Matt. Do you agree with me? Is this the race of the decade?
Well, this was certainly an amazing race for so many reasons. It was Zenyatta's final race. It was a race that went off under the lights at Churchill Downs, and I don't, as I was watching the race, to me, I think maybe that was one of the little factors in that race, because Zenyatta, who we know was one of the great come-behind horses of all time, got farther behind in this race than in any other race. And to me, when I watch this race, I see her coming out of the gate at Churchill Downs under the lights, and she just seems to be looking around at everything that's going on, and just got so far behind a horse that was having a fantastic year in Blame.
Yeah, and Blame, I think, is one of the more underrated horses of this century, of the last 20 years. Matt Blame was that kind of horse. Obviously, he was the best older male in the country, the best male in the country, and Zenyatta was the best female in the country. So it had the battle of the sexes. It had Zenyatta making up all that ground. It had Blame digging down deep when it looked like Zenyatta might get him 20 yards from the wire. Great riders again in this one, and then you had the Horse of the Year controversy afterwards. Despite Blame holding off Zenyatta got the Horse of the Year. This race had a little of everything, including just raw emotion of the fans there that day and into the evening at Churchill Downs. My race of the decade. All right, Matt. 12 of our favorite races. Boy, that was fun. But we're not done yet, folks. We want to give out a few awards here, just to get many of you mad at Matt and I for picking against your favorites. But we decided to just stick with 3 awards here: the Horse of the Decade, the Female Horse of the Decade, and the Turf Horse of the Decade. For me, the easiest one is the Horse of the Decade. It's American Pharoah, Matt. Triple Crown winner, first Triple Crown winner in 37 years.
Absolutely, Brian. I don't think anybody can argue. Well, I shouldn't say anybody, but I think almost everybody will agree with us. Becoming the first Triple Crown winner in 37 years, that alone is enough to garner this honor. But don't forget, he was the 2-year-old champion. Don't forget, he went from winning the Triple Crown to winning the Breeders' Cup Classic. He was not a horse that stayed in the barn. We saw American Pharoah run all over the country, both coasts, and is a worthy winner of our best horse of the decade.
Yeah, and anybody that would argue with that decision as American Pharoah, the only winner of the Grand Slam ever, the Triple Crown and the Breeders' Cup Classic, as Matt said, he was a 2-year-old champion. The only argument anybody has really is that he never raced after 3. But I think he did enough in his 2 seasons at the racetrack, which included 2-year-old championship, 3-year-old championship, Horse of the Year, first Triple Crown winner in 37 years, and the Breeders' Cup Classic in just dominant style. And there were good horses behind him in that Breeders' Cup Classic. He just dominated them. I think American Pharoah was a pretty easy choice. Again, we're talking about American-based horses, so don't throw Winks or Frankel at us, folks. But American Pharoah did it all in his 11-race career. The female of the decade, Matt, this might be a contentious point for us or for a lot of our fans. We chose Beholder as our female horse of the decade, Matt, over Zenyatta.
Well, Brian, just to be fair here, and just to remind people, a big part of that Zenyatta career came in 2009, came in the decade before. So that I think was a big factor in our decision-making process in there, because if you look at that, those 20 wins and 21 starts, that's a different story. But a big part of that came in the decade before. Our female decade horse of the year is Beholder, and we've talked about it a little bit already. So many Eclipse Awards in 4 different years, 3 different Breeders' Cup victories, including that stellar performance over Songbird.
Yeah, she had a little bit of forego in her, Matt. Not in looks, not in size or even gender. But if not for a little setback during her 4-year-old year, I think we're talking about a filly that would have been a 5-year Eclipse Award winner. She was the 2-year-old filly champion, the 3-year-old filly champion, and she was twice the older female of the year. But she easily could have been. She looked like the best older female the year where she missed the second half of the year. Like Matt said, she did it all. I'll remember her for that win over Songbird. I'll remember her as such a smart horse around the barn. She had a real aura around her, trained by Richard Mandella, of course. But also remember that Pacific Classic, Matt. I think Brett's showing that Pacific Classic now. The way she went from, I'm not sure what it was, third or fourth on the turn to first in a heartbeat, turn a foot, and just left those older males in her dust was breathtaking. And there's a lot of good to remember in Beholder's 26 race career. You can talk about Zenyatta, you can talk about Songbird, you can talk about a bunch of females, but Beholder did it over a really 5-season span. So she's our female of the decade. Matt, who's our turf horse of the decade? Because we just saw Bricks and Mortar, I think, clinch the Horse of the Year award with a super undefeated season this year in 2019. Is he our turf horse of the decade?
He is not, because there was another horse who achieved what Bricks and Mortar did, Horse of the Year. He did it twice, Brian. He won at the Breeders' Cup twice, and that, of course, is the warrior Wise Dan.
He's a warrior for sure. A son of Lisa Danielle, that nice brood mare here in Kentucky. You know, I saw him break his maiden at Turfway Park, Matt. Wise Dan, what a nice horse he was. He could actually, he's our turf horse of the decade, but he actually was a darn good horse on dirt. In fact, I think a lot of people will forget that he ran in the Breeders' Cup Sprint early in his career, but those 2 Breeders' Cup mile wins in a row, clearly the best, run as fast as you want to run a mile. He won the Woodbine Mile impressively 2 straight years. He was the best horse in America those 2 years and rightfully won the Horse of the Year. And Matt, I think we're showing a strange race because it wasn't fast and it wasn't a huge race. It was the Firecracker, but there's reasons why we're showing that Firecracker.
Yeah, that's for sure. Like you said, I mean, we could have showed either one of those Breeders' Cup Mile victories against stellar fields in there, but that Firecracker Day at Churchill Downs, it was a wet and rainy and soggy turf course, and Wise Dan was bottled up along the hedge with no place to go for a long time. And I don't know, I think at some point he just said, I'm going to find a way through on my own to Johnny V, who was his regular rider, and he just clipped the hedges there and somehow bowled his way through along the rail to get that opening. I just thought it was such a spectacular and gutsy performance, which was so characteristic of Wise Dan, one of those horses that didn't like to win and was determined to get to the line.
Yeah, you're stealing a little bit of my thunder here, Matt, because I think this race kind of sums up what Wise Dan had internally, what kind of horse he was as far as his heart and his determination to win a race. You can see it in his Firecracker. You know, we knew he was going to win the Firecracker. He was just better than the other horses in the race. But literally, he was bottled up the last half of the race. I mean, he never had anywhere to go. And I've never seen it. I've seen horses bump the rail and win a race before, but this horse was just running on the hedges. He came back with hedge burns after saying the bushes nor the horse not giving him room on the rail were going to prevent him from winning. And that's the kind of horse Wise Dan was, trained by, of course, Charles Lopresti. All right, folks, that's our best of the decades. I hope you enjoyed it. Matt and I love doing this show. Unfortunately, you're going to have to wait another 10 years before we do this show again.
Yeah, that's a scary thought, Bri.
Yeah, we'll be back in 10 years to do the show, but we'll be back sooner than that. Hey, Matt, can I get a parting shot from you?
Hey, folks, I hope you enjoyed the show and you enjoy the last week of the decade. And please tell us if you think we left out any big races or any important horses or who you thought should have been the top horse. Send us a comment in either on the Horse Racing Nation page or in the YouTube comments. And as always, we can't do the show without our great producer, the producer of the decade, Brett Workman.
We haven't decided the producer of the decade yet. Jumping the gun. And another disclaimer, Bricks and Mortar is not yet the horse of the year, but we certainly expect him to be. All right, 10 years until our next Best of the Decade show, but Matt and I will be back next week with another great show. We want to thank Brett, our producer. We also want to thank you, the fans, for tuning in every week. We love having you here on HorseCenter. We also want to thank our sponsor, Derby Wars, the best, easy for me to say, the best contest site out there. Don't wait 10 years for another HorseCenter, folks. We'll be back right here next week with another exciting show.